Thank you, and thanks for that introduction. I'm going to also start sharing my screen in a moment, and I can't promise that what I'm about to say necessarily goes perfectly with the preceding papers, but there's certainly some points in common. I expect it will feel more like the paper to come, given by Norma on political imagination, because we've actually done some work together on this issue. So today, what I'm going to try to do is to conceptualize political images in relation to political imagination. But to do that, I'm going to have to start by talking about images in general. And I'm going to do that with reference to this kind of schematic presentation by Tom Mitchell in his seminal work about images, where he thinks of images as being made up of this kind of family tree with graphic, optical, perceptual, mental, and verbal images. But he figures them all as being descended from this sort of parent notion of image, meaning something like a likeness, resemblance, or similitude, which is a kind of non-literal or non-pictorial sense of image. He says an abstract, general, spiritual likeness. So when image refers to something like a model or a schema. So you can see on this chart that some of them are like mental images that relate to an individual mind, which may or may not be communicated, such as dreams. And other images have material presences in the material world, like paintings or the examples that Yufat was talking about earlier, or even the digital images are they kind of have an electronic being as well. Now, since kind of producing that schema, Mitchell has also discriminated between pictures and images, but in a different sense. He's talking about the kind of notion that an image is what appears in the picture being kind of material, the image being non-material. So he kind of says you can hang a picture, but you can't hang an image. Well, I should point out that this distinction doesn't work in all languages. In German, they use the same word, but I'll go with that distinction here. So he says that the image always needs a material support to appear, though it's really quite highly abstract itself, rather minimal entity, he calls it. So, this kind of heuristic distinction between picture and image may remind people of the difference between the sign and the signifier that we know from semiotics. And what I'm going to suggest in part is that we need, rather than that binary model, we need a ternary model, because the material supports that Mitchell talks about need to be extended to take into account not only the materiality of the medium or the picture, but also the concrete social, cultural, and political practices that sustain such images. So that's the practices of image making, image circulation, and image interpretation. Now, that distinction between image and picture makes sense when I kind of move on and start talking about political images. So going back to 2008, maybe more hopeful times, we can kind of see here that there's a difference between the image of Barack Obama in terms of these ideas of hope and change we can believe in, and all the pictures of him. But on top of that, to look at the other set of practices, we have to think about that huge PR campaign that was paid for in order to kind of create this image for him, bearing in mind that included his best-selling book, The Audacity of Hope. So a lot goes into making up that image. Now, in terms of scholarship about political images, then there seems to be kind of variations on a theme. So Bernard Manning defines political images as highly simplified and schematic mental representations that are relatively hazy, yet they do have significant content. And John Corner and Dick Pelz claim that political figures or persona who operate through the media like celebrities managed to condense particular themes and emotions in a spectacular display of character and style. Bruce Grunbeck from the field of rhetoric proposes that in contemporary mediated political discourse, political messages are complex composites of multiple discourses created in verbal, visual, and acoustic languages. So it says political messages are conveyed as composite images and condensations, which explains why they're both quite vague, but also very economical. And similarly, practitioners and scholars of political marketing, such as Margaret Scammell, understand images in terms of the reputation, the trustworthiness, and credibility of the candidates or parties. So those are all kind of abstract qualities that relate to something physical, even if it's the physicality of a person. Okay, so then why, you may ask, why do I need to think about political imagination in relation to political imaging? So I think it's going to be a useful way to think about those practices and activities that constitute images, including political images. But on top of that, there's also a rich tradition of valuing political imagination in progressive politics. So Richard Kearney has observed that modern European philosophy has a positive attitude to imagination, especially the Romantic movement, seeing imagination as the creative transformation of the real into the ideal, that is, making what is present absent and what is absent present. And in a socialist version of this radical imagination, Eric Olin Wright talks about real utopias that embrace the tension between dreams and practices. And he argues that that what is possible is actually shaped by our visions and imagination. So belief in radically different alternative futures is a political force in itself. In Robin Kelly's account of the American Black radical imagination, visions and dreams also appear to be a political power, no matter whether they fail or succeed. And Kelly says that progressive social movements produce a poetic knowledge in the form of imagination of a future in the present. That again resonates with some things in Ifat's presentation. So in the example by Kelly, although both in its heyday and now the idea of return to Africa seems impractical, it still indicates what Black people want in a deep sense. So we've got radical utopias, which are visions, they're images of what the future could be and should be, which serve as rough guides for political progressive movements. But even very humdrum politics works with projections and anticipations of the future. So all the time, government ministers are saying, if we implement this policy, this will be the effect. So we can see from this in part that political imagination is always a public activity and not a private event. So Martin Luther King says, I have a dream, but he was dreaming for the whole of the USA, in fact, beyond the USA as well. And a similar point is made by C. Wright Mills, who writes about a sociological imagination, which is focused on issues that belong to a larger social structure. So for Mills, an issue is about a crisis in an institution, not a crisis for an individual. So not just something that someone kind of experiences in their immediate milieu, their family, but something that speaks to that larger social structure. And on top of that, there are other ways in which political imagination is necessarily about public and shared activity. So Hannah Arendt sees imagination in the relationships that emerge among people who can envision each other's point of view. She says to think in an enlarged mentality means that one trains one imagination to go visiting, such as by reading literature. And closer to Tel Aviv, at least in the past, Ariella Azulai radicalizes that perspective, I think, by calling spectators of photography to see themselves as citizens who have the ability to imagine a political state of being that deviates significantly from the prevailing state of affairs. So one sees the world differently by embracing the kind of intersubjective knowledge provoked by cultural artifacts. I think that's true for both ARENDT and for Azoulay. Going off on a slightly different track, Benedict Anderson claims that all political communities beyond those of face-to-face communication are imagined. So imagined doesn't mean fabricated in the sense of false, but that it's a cultural artifact. And his focus is on nations, but he also thinks about religious communities. And all these communities have material conditions, notably media technologies and means of production and distribution. So it was print capitalism for nationalist imagination, especially novels and newspapers. So a political community, he says, is made up of people who imagine that they have a similar life journey or common experience. A real experience, imagined meaning is how he puts it. So there are always technical and cultural means and administrative measures that give shape to the community in terms of its time, its space, relations between people and with other communities. So for the colonial states that he wrote about, it was the census, the map, and the museum, each of which involves different types of images. And radical movements themselves, to kind of depart from Anderson, they also try to build their own cultures as they prefigure the world they would like to bring about, embodying the change they want to happen. Now, I'm just going to kind of do a section that engages with Bottich's book about imaginal politics, because I think that the direction I'm taking can deal with the discomfort that she has about the term imagination, and that prompts her to think about this notion of the imaginal to avoid the pitfall. So at the heart of her book is an effort to overcome a tension that she's found in Castoriadis's work between, on the one hand, the imagination of the individual, the creative faculty to imagine different possible worlds, and then these captivating social imaginaries that are constraining the radical political imagination. And she notes that the tension between them is also a tension between the philosophy of the subject and the metaphysics of determination by the social context. And she reckons the imaginal can get us out of that dichotomy, that tension, because it's composed of images, which is, I think rightly says, aren't merely representations, but their presences in themselves, independent of the faculty of imagination. And as I've been saying, she also sees in the imaginal as being inherently social and public, about communication, mediating between immaterial and the kind of sensuous material world, or between what Mitchell calls images and pictures. And like ARENDT, Bottici also focuses on the capacity of art, especially literature, to cultivate humanity and imagination that enables an understanding of others. But I'm going to say in kind of what remains, so I'll actually stop sharing my screen, that we should just stick with the term imagination. It's perfect. It's perfectly good. And that's because I think I kind of disagree a little bit with how she understands how imagination works with images. So again, I believe she's right to make us think about mediation and communication, because mediation of images is integral to politics. But political imagination, in my view, isn't only about mediating ideas of possible worlds or utopias. As outlined above, it's also practical. There are political acts of imagination that are public. So imagination isn't only about states of minds or ideas that can be communicated with other minds, but it's the material activity that's constitutive of ideas and communities and mediated representation. So that goes back to the kind of classic three terms of media studies, of being about production, circulation, and interpretation. And it's in that process of imagination that ideas, representations, and social activity are necessarily unfolded. And as I imagine I'm kind of pretty much at the end of my time, I'd just say very quickly that kind of part of what Bottici and others try to do is to sort of try and say, well, political imagination is kind of a good quality. It's a virtue. It's something that we should encourage. And what I want to say is that just as political images can be kind of good or bad, to put it crudely, then political imagination can be practiced well or it can be practiced badly. And it's a much bigger question to figure out when political imagination is being done well than it is to kind of establish that good progressive politics will always need political imagination to function. Thank you.